Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France at the age of just 34. But within a decade, he lost everything. How did this happen? In 1799, a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte seized power in a coup d'etat and established himself as the first consul of France. Although the title of first consul didn't come with the powers of an emperor, Napoleon had grander ambitions. He wanted to be the emperor of not only France, but all of Europe. But to do that, he needed to change how people viewed him. You see, for centuries, the French public associated their emperors with the sun god Apollo. They were seen as divine rulers, chosen by God to lead the French people. However, Napoleon wasn't from the French nobility. He was an upstart general who had worked his way up the ranks through sheer willpower and ambition. The French public didn't see him as a god, but as a man who got lucky. So to get the public on his side, Napoleon needed to orchestrate a spectacular event that would convince them of his greatness. And what could be more spectacular than crowning himself emperor? But there was one problem. Napoleon wasn't related to the previous royal family. He also wasn't appointed by the Estates General or elected by the people. He simply took power after a military coup. So, crowning himself emperor would be an act of usurpation. And usurpers weren't usually seen as legitimate rulers. To get around this, Napoleon decided to create a new dynasty. Instead of taking the crown as Napoleon I of the Bourbon dynasty, he would be Napoleon I of the Napoleonic dynasty. It was a clever solution, but would it work? Well, he was about to find out, because on May 18, 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of France in a lavish ceremony at Notre Dame Cathedral. He wore the traditional robes and carried the scepter and orb, and when he placed the crown on his head, the entire cathedral erupted into applause. Napoleon had convinced the French people he was their emperor, but now he needed to convince the rest of Europe. Unfortunately, they didn't make it easy for him, because 2 months before Napoleon's coronation, the British had invaded the Iberian Peninsula. The Spanish people rose up against their French oppressors and kicked them out. But when Napoleon heard about this, he sent troops to put down the rebellion, and before long, most of the Iberian Peninsula was back under French control. But this enraged the people of Spain and Portugal, so they began harassing the French supply lines. And since Napoleon couldn't tolerate such insolence, he declared war on them. This wasn't good timing, because just as Napoleon was preparing for war in the Iberian Peninsula, the Austrian Empire declared war on him. You see, Austria was unhappy with the Treaty of Campo Formio, which ended the War of the First Coalition. The treaty gave Venice to Austria, but it also gave Napoleon control of northern Italy. And although this territory was largely Catholic, he began promoting secularism over religion, which outraged the Austrians. So they went to war. And as if Napoleon didn't have enough problems, the Russians also declared war on him. This was due to a minor incident where the Russians captured some Danish ships in the Baltic Sea. When Napoleon heard about this, he assumed the Russians were trying to aid the British, so he declared war on them as well. Within a few months, Napoleon found himself fighting 3 separate wars. However, despite being outnumbered, Napoleon's army was too strong for the coalitions. He defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Karansebes, then chased them all the way back to Vienna. But as he entered the city, he learned that the Russians had set up camp nearby. Napoleon immediately marched to meet them, but he was too late. The Russians had already left. He had missed them by only days. This led him on a wild goose chase across Europe, but the Russians were always just out of reach. Finally, both sides made camp for the winter. Napoleon spent his time in northern Italy, while the Russians fortified their position in western Ukraine. And when spring arrived, they went back to war. At first, the Russians had the upper hand. They ambushed several French battalions and pushed them back across the Alps. But Napoleon wasn't deterred. He rallied his troops and attacked the Russians again. But even though the French were better trained and equipped, the Russians had something they were more familiar with: vast open spaces. You see, warfare in the hilly terrain of northern Italy looked very different than it did on the open fields of Russia. In the hills, battles were fought between small groups of soldiers using things like cannons and fortifications. But in the plains, warfare was much more fluid. Large groups of soldiers charged across the open field, often getting wiped out in the process. The French were excellent at siege warfare, but they had no experience with open field tactics, and as a result, They suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Caroncevis. This was a disaster for Napoleon, but it was only the beginning of his troubles. You see, while Napoleon was chasing the Russians across Europe, his brother Joseph had been placed in charge of running France, and being in charge of running a country wasn't exactly his strong suit. For starters, he tried to raise taxes to pay for Napoleon's wars, but the French people weren't happy about this, so they rebelled. Then, to make matters worse, Joseph got into a massive disagreement with the Pope over church property. As a compromise, the Pope offered to forgive all of France's debt if Joseph returned all the church property. But when Joseph rejected this offer, the Pope excommunicated him. Overnight, Napoleon went from being the most popular general in France to being the most hated emperor. His subjects saw him as a heretic who defied the church, and many began calling for his abdication. With his popularity plummeting, Napoleon was forced to return to France and put down the revolt. But this just gave his enemies more ammunition. They claimed Napoleon had abandoned the war and fled like a coward. But before they could rally the troops, Napoleon struck back. He launched a surprise attack on the Austrians and crushed them at the Battle of Caroncevis. But this victory came at a steep price. Napoleon had suffered severe injuries and had to be carried off the battlefield. When his doctors examined him, they had some grim news. Napoleon had been wounded so badly, they couldn't save his leg. Soon after, they amputated it, and when he awoke from the surgery, they told him they had given away his military career. Napoleon might have been able to overcome his health problems, but without his leg, he would never be able to ride a horse again, and without a horse, he wouldn't be able to lead his armies into battle. Despite this devastating news, Napoleon still had one chance to save his empire. If he could win a decisive victory, his enemies would be forced to make peace with him. Unfortunately, he wasn't going to get that chance because just as he was recovering from his injuries, the Russians came back with a vengeance. They allied with the Austrians, the British, the Swedes, and the Ottomans, and launched a massive invasion of France. Napoleon was desperate to stop them, but after examining his wounds, his doctors told him he wasn't fit to lead an army. To make matters worse, his generals weren't exactly eager to take command. Many of them thought the war was hopeless, and with Napoleon unable to lead them, they refused to fight. After seeing his generals refuse to fight, the remaining loyal troops turned to Napoleon and demanded he abdicate. Faced with no other options, Napoleon agreed. He officially stepped down as emperor and was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. Just weeks later, his enemies invaded France and restored the Bourbons to the throne. Louis XVIII became king, and Napoleon's former territories were divided among the victors. Napoleon might have been able to live out the rest of his days in Elba, but when the British heard he was there, they brought him to St. Helena, an isolated island in the Indian Ocean. He spent his last 6 years in exile there and died in 1821, when he was just 51 years old. Napoleon might have become famous for his military victories, but he is just as well known for his disastrous invasion of Russia. To learn why 600,000 French soldiers marched into Russia, only for 10,000 to return, stay tuned.